Hey, what's up everybody? Landan with LMR.com. In this video, we're gonna be showing you how to reinstall your manual transmission as well as install a new clutch disc, pressure plate, flywheel, slave cylinder, and any other component related to this procedure. Before we get rolling any further, I'll be the first to tell you you're gonna need some good mechanical knowledge as well as a pretty good selection of tools if you plan on tackling this yourself. The car we're gonna be working on today, this is LMR's 2013 Candy Red GT. Probably have seen the other videos related to this car in terms of the transmission stuff, which includes servicing the rear main seal, as well as the video of removing all these components. So same as those videos, Scott Hubbard's gonna be doing the work. If you're watching this video and you own a 2015 to 2023 Mustang, a lot of the steps you'll find will be similar, but let's think logically here. Ford changes stuff throughout the year ranges. So if you're referencing this video for a 2015 to 2023 Coyote car, there may be some bolt differences, there may be more bolts, there may be less bolts, there also may be a little bit different procedure as well as some different components. So just keep that in mind, again, if you're referencing this video for a 2015 to 2023 car. Also, it's important to note, read the owner's manual or reference Ford.com for your particular car. That way you can see the newest revision of the owner's manual and you can reference the right fluid and the capacities for this job. It's also important to note that while we were installing new components into this car, we were originally going to use a Ram flywheel with a Ford OEM clutch disc and pressure plate. Well, those didn't agree with each other. The recessed area on the flywheel had some interference with the torsional springs on the Ford OEM clutch disc. So we had to swap the Ram flywheel out for an OEM flywheel. So just keep that stuff in mind whenever you start going to buy components or new parts for your car. You may want to keep things to a specific brand just in case. While you're here, this is a lot of work. I would replace and upgrade things if they're on your list. One of those things for sure is a rear main seal. Think about your clutch line and think about also running a remote reservoir. If you're interested in a remote reservoir and a stainless clutch line, check out the links below, because during the installation of all the components for this car, we did install an SVE stainless clutch line as well as an SVE remote reservoir. I think that's everything. I think I've covered kind of all the fine print. So if y'all have any questions, remember you can always drop us a comment. So enough of my rambling, let's get moving with the process. To get started with the reassembly, we'll need to install a new pilot bearing. Like I mentioned in the removal procedure, this is either going to come out clean or the race is going to stay behind in the crankshaft. Position the new bearing into place with the flange side facing towards you. Use an appropriate width socket and drive the new bearing into place with a hammer until it's fully seated. If the race stayed behind, align the new bearing and use an appropriate width socket to drive the bearing from the new race into the existing race until it's flush. Open the new clutch kit and find the locating tool in the new dowels. Depending on the brand of clutch, some do not come with an alignment tool or new dowels. Make sure you read the product pages on LMR.com to verify kit components. Position the new flywheel face down on a workbench as if it was installed onto the engine. Place the pressure plate over the flywheel and align it with the dowel pin holes. For clarity, we're marking the locations with a paint pen, that way it's easier to see where they go. Set the pressure plate aside and then drive the dowel pins into their respective locations with a hammer until they're fully seated. Clean and inspect the bell housing spacer plate. If it's bent, you may have to replace it. A warped or bent spacer plate will cause starter engagement issues. Scuff the dowel pins in the engine block with a wire brush and then apply some anti-seize. Reinstall the spacer plate in the correct orientation. To help hold it in place, use a small pointed punch and hammer to leave a small indentation around the dowel pins. Next, we're going to prepare the ARP flywheel bolts for installation. ARP calls for specific instructions with most of their hardware. These particular flywheel bolts need ARP's assembly lubricant underneath the bolt heads. Per ARP's instructions, apply Loctite 242 blue thread locking compound to the threads. Position the flywheel over the crankshaft in the correct orientation and then rotate it until all the bolt holes are aligned. Thread in all the bolts by hand and then run them down evenly without tightening. If you don't have the special flywheel holding tool, reinstall one of the transmission to engine block bolts and set a large flathead screwdriver underneath the bolt. Place the end of the screwdriver into one of the teeth on the flywheel. Torque each fastener to 70 foot-pounds with a 12-point 3/4 inch socket working in a criss-cross or alternating pattern, starting with the bolt at the 12 o'clock position. Per the Ford Workshop manual, the factory bolts are torque to yield and they need to be replaced. When installing new Ford flywheel bolts, torque in 2 stages. The first stage is to 177 inch-pounds, and then stage 2 is to tighten each bolt an additional 60 degrees. Wipe the flywheel surface with a clean towel and brake clean. Place the clutch disc onto the flywheel in the correct orientation and then slide the alignment tool into place. Now we're going to assemble the ARP pressure plate bolts. If you study the washer, you'll notice that one side has a small countersink or taper. This gets positioned underneath the bolt head. Install all the washers over the bolts in the correct orientation. Wipe the pressure plate with a clean towel and brake clean. Position the pressure plate onto the dowels in the flywheel and then install all of the retaining bolts. Run all of these down, but leave a little wiggle room for the clutch disc, that way you can make sure it's centered. Verify that the disc is centered and then snug down each bolt. Torque the ARP bolts in a crisscross pattern or alternating pattern to 54 foot-pounds, starting with the bolt at the 5 o'clock position. Like the factory flywheel bolts, the factory pressure plate bolts are also torqued to yield per the Ford workshop manual. When installing new Ford pressure plate bolts, torque in 2 stages. The first stage is to 46 foot-pounds, and then stage 2 is to tighten each bolt an additional 60 degrees. Remove the bolt that you used as leverage to hold the flywheel. Remove the clutch alignment tool. Back over to the transmission, use a 12mm line wrench to loosen the tube nut from the slave cylinder. Loosen and remove the 2 8mm bolts securing the slave cylinder to the transmission. Remove the slave cylinder and set it aside. Use a flathead screwdriver to depress the tabs on the clip securing the hard line to the transmission. Maneuver the hard line to remove it from the transmission. Separate the plastic clip from the hard line and reinstall it back into the transmission. Place the new slave cylinder on a workbench and remove any tags or labels. Pour the correct brake fluid for your application into a small cup and submerge the end of the hard line into the fluid. Actuate the cylinder by hand to bench bleed it. If needed, add more fluid to your cup so the cylinder doesn't pull any air. Position the slave cylinder into place and verify that the tab engages. Reinstall the retaining bolts and torque them to 97 inch-pounds. Loosen and remove the fill plug on the side of the transmission with an 8mm hex socket. Refer to your owner's manual or Ford.com for the proper transmission fluid for your application. Open one of the quart bottles and pour in the MT82 additive if your application calls for it. Either use a point attachment on the bottle or a small funnel to fill the transmission. Fill the transmission with the correct amount of fluid per the owner's manual. Reinstall the fill plug and torque it to 26 foot-pounds. Wipe up any spillage. Apply anti-seize to the 2 holes in the transmission where it slides over the dowel pins. Yes, we already applied some to the dowel pins, but a little extra dab on the transmission won't hurt anything. Reposition the transmission near the engine and prepare for reinstallation. Clean the gear shift lever bolt and apply some anti-seize to it. Pre-install the gear shift lever assembly bolt, that way you can pull it out far enough to position the shifter lever assembly into place and then you can slide it back in. Go ahead and pre-install the upper transmission to engine block bolts, that way they're ready to roll. The one with the stud gets positioned at the top on the passenger side. Raise the transmission and situate it to the engine. We left it in gear, that way we know the splines on the input shaft are engaged with the clutch disc. Reinstall the accessible transmission to engine block bolts on both sides and make sure they thread in by hand. You may have to push the harness away from the top of the transmission, that way it sits flush against the engine. Run all the bolts down by hand until they're snug. These torque to 35 foot-pounds. Reposition the wiring harness and reattach the clips. Reconnect any electrical connector that is accessible at this time. You may have to retape your harness clips if they come off with some electrical tape. Retighten the gear shift lever bolt and do your best to torque it to 133 inch-pounds. Slide the longer bolt towards the passenger side and reposition the lever assembly. Run down the bolt and then torque it to 30 foot-pounds. Release the gear shift lever and make sure the transmission is in neutral by spinning the flange. Make note of the orientation arrow on the transmission crossmember. Reposition the crossmember and start the bolts by hand. Neutralize or center the transmission and then run down the 18mm bolts. These torque to 46 foot-pounds. Remove the strap from the transmission and get the jack out of the way. Reinstall the transmission mount nuts with a 15mm deep socket and torque them to 52 foot-pounds. Next, we'll need to work quickly to prevent as much fluid as we can from running out of the output shaft speed sensor location. Have the sensor ready to go and swap it with the plug. Fully seat the sensor and reinstall the T30 Torx bolt. This bolt torques to 89 inch-pounds. Wipe up any spillage with brake clean and a towel. Reconnect the electrical connection. Go ahead and clean up the inspection plate. Reinstall it back onto the transmission. Run down the 13mm retaining bolts and torque them to 26 inch-pounds. Reinstall the starter back into place and run down the 3 10mm bolts. Because of the tight working area, do your best to torque these to 18 foot-pounds. Since we upgraded to an aftermarket stainless clutch line, we'll need to transfer the factory plastic 90-degree adapter. You'll need to work quickly when doing this, as fluid is going to drip from the line. Transfer the adapter to the clutch line and then install the adapter into the fitting on the transmission. You'll hear an audible click indicating that the clip is engaged, but I would still verify this by gently pulling it away from the transmission just to make sure it's fully engaged. If you aren't installing an aftermarket clutch line, remove the cap from the adapter and reinstall it. If they were removed for extra working room, reinstall the heat shields and hand tighten the 10mm nuts. Reposition the drive shaft into place and align the index marks on the front flanges. Reinstall all 4 of the bolts by hand and snug them down evenly with a swiveling 12-point 12mm socket. Make sure the spacers are still in place and then align the carrier bearing bolts with the body of the car and run down the 13mm bolts. These torque to 35 foot-pounds. Reposition the rear of the drive shaft and align the index marks. Install the bolts, run them down with a swiveling 10mm socket and torque them in a star pattern to 41 foot-pounds. Back at the front of the drive shaft, torque these bolts in a cross pattern to 76 foot-pounds. Apply some anti-seize to the threads on the driver's side upstream oxygen sensor. Rotate the sensor as if you're loosening it first just a few turns before you install it. Doing this will prevent the wires from bunching up. Now there is no way to torque this, so do your best to get to 35 foot-pounds. You can either use the 7/8 open-end wrench or the specialty tool. Go ahead and apply some anti-seize to the threads on the 2 downstream oxygen sensor threads, the studs on the mid-pipe, and the inner area on the exhaust sleeves. Reposition the mid-pipe back into the car and figure out a way to hold it in place while you loosely install the manifold to mid-pipe retaining nuts. Slide the sleeves over the mid-pipe. Fully tighten the manifold to mid-pipe retaining nuts with a 15mm ratcheting wrench. Like other hardware, it's impossible to torque these, but the spec is 30 foot-pounds. Like we did in the removal steps, use a long extension or multiple extensions with a 15mm socket on a wobble adapter to tighten the other 2 nuts from the engine bay. Reinstall the 2 downstream oxygen sensors in the same manner as the previous sensor. Tighten each sensor with a 7/8 open-end wrench or the specialty tool. Lift the over-axle pipes until the exhaust components are even. Tighten the sleeves with a 15mm deep socket and torque the nuts to 35 foot-pounds. Reinstall the cross brace and torque the 15mm nuts to 35 foot-pounds. Back in the engine bay, if you installed an aftermarket clutch line, make sure it's zip tied away from the steering shaft and exhaust components. Since we installed the SVE remote clutch reservoir kit, we added fluid to this reservoir instead of the master cylinder. Be careful not to get any fluid on painted surfaces. If you do, clean the affected area immediately. Now, if you don't have the remote clutch reservoir kit, top off the master cylinder with the correct fluid per your application. First, you want to bleed the system by operating the clutch pedal with your hand. Whenever you feel some resistance, add fluid to the reservoir. Continue bleeding the system with your foot until the clutch pedal effort is consistent. Reinstall the intake manifold cover. Reposition the strut tower brace and the retaining nuts. Torque the 4 13mm nuts to 26 foot-pounds. Reconnect the negative battery cable. Per the Ford Workshop Manual, a crank relearn is required. This can be done with most handheld tuning devices or other dedicated automotive diagnostic devices. You want to drive responsibly for roughly 500 miles or so to allow for proper break-in of the new clutch components. After that, you're good to go. All right, everybody, that's gonna wrap things up. Like I mentioned before we got rolling with the video, if you have any questions on any of this stuff, drop us a comment. We'll be sure to help you out. As always, hope you found a ton of value in this video. If you did, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and turn on notifications. That way you're notified every time we release something new. And until we see you in the next one, y'all know what to do for all things S197 Mustang. Keep it right here with the Real Enthusiast, LMR.com.